Welcome to Formed, where each week we navigate a relevant topic or question through honest conversations. We are three pastors with three different backgrounds on staff together at Irving Bible Church in Irving, Texas. We believe we are constantly being formed in the way of Jesus for the sake of the world, and we hope this podcast helps with that. So let's jump into this week's episode of Formed. Welcome back to another week of Formed. We're back hanging out together.
Here we are.
Yes, we are.
And the weather is still in the 90s, unfortunately.
It is. It's 76 right now, so we can
Not bad.
We can work with that.
Yeah, we can
Not
start
bad.
there.
We
Yeah.
can work with that.
Tolerable.
So we're starting a two-part series. So we haven't done, I wouldn't say series, but we haven't done like a two-parter yet on the podcast. And just because when we did, we kind of did a mailbag thing a while back of saying, we asked listeners like, hey, submit questions. We got all these questions. A lot of them we couldn't get to, but I try to take some that were submitted a lot. And it's like, all right, let's kind of pull these off and like make them their own separate episodes. And I would say the number one thing that we got back multiple times was do an episode on deconstruction. And so we kind of like set it aside, and then you went on sabbatical.
Yeah.
So then we're like, we got to wait for Barry
Can't do it without you. Yeah.
to touch on deconstruction because, I mean, if you had to, I'll just throw this out there. If you had to, I don't even know the way to say this, but as far as like popular terms or things that have been under the spotlight the most, or phrases in the evangelical world over the past 5 years, would you say deconstruction is like right at the top? One,
Yeah, I mean,
two, three?
it's funny. We're talking about it, and it's like it's almost gotten to the point where, okay, I think people are starting to get really just tired of hearing about it
Right.
a little bit. You know, it's really important. I think we're doing a sermon series at the church right now where we're addressing some of these things. I think the church needs to talk about it, but I think there is a sense in which it's like it's been so much out there, so much talked about, so
Right.
all over the place in social media. And so, yeah, I think people are beginning to go, okay, can we
Enough.
call it
Yeah.
something else?
Yeah.
Or can we, these are important things we need to talk about.
Yeah.
But
And like a lot of things, it's like now once something is around for a while, then it starts taking all these different forms
Yep.
Right.
and
Yep.
all these
Right.
different definitions. And it feels like I've just seen different famous people, for lack of a better term, like
Yeah.
every, 2 or 3 months, like, oh, okay, this person's like on their Instagram. And I'm not saying it's like not genuine, but it's like it feels like kind of a
The thing to do.
popular thing.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
with it's, but I'm like, I don't want to take anything from it because we're obviously going to do 2 episodes on it. And we were talking about Joshua Harris before, popular book when I don't even know what age I was, middle school.
We
high
were.
school?
yeah,
Probably
what,
high
late
school,
90s,
yeah,
early
yeah,
2000s,
yeah.
something like that.
Okay, so I was in middle school.
Yeah.
And we all.
It was when I was a youth pastor.
Oh,
Yeah. I think it was college.
you were a youth pastor when this book was like hitting.
I think maybe so.
Yeah.
If you're unfamiliar with the book, it is
It was-
I Kissed Dating Goodbye. Was that what brought in like the purity rings?
There was
Made
a
it
little bit that was happening
popular.
before that.
Yeah.
That was in some ways sort of the pinnacle of that, kind of purity culture thing happening in youth ministries and churches all over the country. So, yeah.
We're getting a laugh over
We
here.
got a
about
snicker from Phil. Yeah.
I love the Snickers behind camera. they bring me a lot of joy. But okay, so let's just from the beginning. Let's just start with kind of like let's work on defining it, if that's possible. What's like your definition of what deconstruction is?
So I would say deconstruction is not a new thing, and yet, as we've just mentioned earlier, we find ourselves in a cultural moment where more and more people are talking about this. And to your point, what's confusing is there isn't this one simple definition. So deconstruction means different things to different people. The extent to which people are deconstructing is really based on the individual's experience, and so there's a lot of confusion around it. So deconstruction finds its roots in philosophy and in this idea of textual criticism. And so often when people are talking about it, they're talking about it from the perspective of the fundamental doctrines of the Christian faith. The historical teachings of the Christian faith have been created or crafted in such a way to make us almost like pawns and to suppress our personhood. And so we're just going to throw the whole thing out. And so oftentimes when people talk about deconstruction, it's to walk away from the historical teachings of the Christian faith, to be agnostic or atheist or something like that. Then there's another way to talk about it, I think, where it's still believing in Jesus and yet struggling with the church and with religious institutions, abuse of power and scandals and all of that. But I think when I think about it and how we're talking about it here, and Barry, I think you'll share a better definition than me because I really liked what you shared a couple weeks ago. But I think about it in terms of it's taking apart the faith that maybe the faith that you grew up with or that culture has imposed upon you in some ways. And so it's taking it apart, but often people stop right there. And I think deconstruction, the way I'd love to talk about it, it's not just taking it apart. It's critically evaluating it, examining it, but then saying, now how do I put this back together? Bringing those questions, bringing those doubts to God, but then putting it back together that in the end it leads us to a more biblical, a more authentic, a more credible, a more internally consistent faith. And so it strengthens our faith. It gives us a faith that we can understand and also appreciate in ways that perhaps we didn't earlier.
Yeah, it's really good. Yeah, I mean, I think there's a whole lot of people that experience something akin to deconstruction who may have no idea who Jacques Derrida is,
right?
And know nothing about that kind of philosophical milieu. And yet, what has come into popular culture from this kind of philosophical movement has been this, what we might call a hermeneutic of suspicion. The idea that I'm have a sort of suspicious disposition toward things that have been inherited from the past, to tradition, to systems, to religion, to worldviews that have been sort of passed down. So that's sort of, in some ways, the kind of water we're swimming in a little bit, culturally speaking. But then I think part of it is just a natural human development, right? Of, you can think about faith in terms of the faith that is passed on to you growing up. Many of us, that have grown up in and around church, where you're given a particular way of seeing the world, a way of understanding God, and that's kind of your construction of your faith. But then oftentimes there is a necessary point in a person's development where they have to really examine, is what I have been given, is what I've received really mine?
Right.
And I think that's what's important that we think about, that we talk about, that we normalize, that there is a sense in which what I need to do at some point in my own development, part of spiritual formation, is actually kind of taking apart the constituent parts of my faith that I have received and looking at it, examining it, saying, is this true? Is this good? Is this mine? Right? Like, do I believe this? Is it good? And I think there's a lot, particularly younger people, who are thinking about Christianity, and the question is more, is it good? Right? Is this good for me? Is this good for the world? And part of that is, struggling, having seen, perceptions of the things that they care about in terms of social issues that the church has either not cared about or even sometimes been, on the wrong side of, if you will. And so, is this true? Is this good? Is this mine? I need to say, do I really believe this, for myself? And I think that can be a very important part of someone's spiritual formation, that kind of goes through a taking apart, so as to put back together, right? So a reconstruction that comes through that. And I think about my own journey as through college. I had grown up in the church and became a believer. My faith was very important to me, and yet I went through this period where I had a college professor who was sort of known for being kind of anti-Christian, and what I really discovered about him was he wasn't anti-Christian at all. He was sort of anti-Christians who don't think critically about their faith. And so he really challenged me to think deeply about my faith and to cause me to go and look more deeply at elements of my faith in ways that were kind of like a deconstruction, a taking apart and putting back together, in ways that I came out the other side of that with my faith much stronger and deeper than it was before. So it was a necessary part of my spiritual formation. So Yeah, there are versions of deconstruction that are really more about sort of abandoning faith, walking away from church, walking away from Christianity, or at least walking away from the kind of Christianity that someone might have grown up in. But it doesn't have to be that. In fact, I think
the two are not synonymous.
Yes, right. It can be the taking apart so as to put back together, leading to a place of greater depth, greater strength in one's faith.
I love the metaphor that you've shared and that I've heard others share around the remodeling.
Right.
Such a good metaphor to think about. So remodeling or renovation, that oftentimes when you remodel a house, the foundation stays intact, but you could like rip apart that house so much that you might have to move out. And so you're fixing the floors and the walls and putting in new windows or whatever it is, that at the end that house is now more beautiful, more compelling. It's a better place to live because you did the work of deconstructing it and then reconstructing. And so that's a positive thing. I think oftentimes deconstruction has this negative connotation where lots of people are almost afraid when people talk about, well, I'm in this process of deconstructing. It causes fear and anxiety among Christians. Like, that's not a good thing. And yet I think you're exactly right. It's part of our ongoing spiritual formation, that it's a good thing for us to examine and evaluate our faith. Because very similar to you in college, I went through what I would now call a period of deconstruction, of examining. I'd been given this faith by my parents who really believed it, but I don't think it was mine until I went to this process of thinking, is this really true? And do I really believe this? And I spent time examining other faiths. I spent time examining the historical veracity of was Jesus real? Is the Bible something I should put my trust in? And because I went through this process, I came out on the other end with a faith that is mine now, the faith that I could hold on to and trust because I'd done that work. And it wasn't even me alone. It was bringing those questions, those doubts to God, but also doing that in community that I found really helpful.
So good.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be, I feel like it's almost become popular to like kind of bash on it in that way of like, it has to be this wrecking ball, or it's the, here's a random analogy. It's the like the toothpaste, and then you can't put it back in the tube. And it's like, it doesn't have to be that. Like, it doesn't have to be viewed that way.
And I think part of why we're seeing this so much more now, or at least talked about so much more now, is part of that process is recognizing, you know what, there have been accretions, right? There have been things that have been added onto, that have sort of latched onto this version of faith passed down to me that aren't part of it, right? That aren't of the essence of it, but that have been added on that I want to get rid of, that were toxic, that were unhealthy. So we talked about, the purity culture stuff. God does have a vision for us for our flourishing in terms of sexuality, but that got twisted in some really kind of damaging sorts of ways in this particular movement in the church. But that then kind of got added on to what it means to be a Christian. And so if you weren't sort of abiding by so in other words, what people have had to do is to say, as I pull this apart, some of these things aren't true, or
they're
aren't
things that
good,
should be discarded,
or aren't mine and need to be discarded. I love what you said though too about the importance, and this is even why we're trying to talk about this as a church as a whole. You mentioned doing this work in community, because done completely in isolation, left to your own devices, it can be troubling, right? That you need people around you to be in conversation with, who are challenging you and encouraging you and dialoguing with you about things, pointing you to resources and understandings. I think about the fact that I mentioned in the sermon last week, like, as a pastor, I don't want you to stop asking questions. I want you to keep asking questions and go deeper and deeper in searching for the best answers to those questions, because there are people who have addressed the kinds of questions that you're wrestling with, but sometimes we need to engage in those the seeking for answers in community to help us find the best answers to the questions that we wrestle with.
That's why I love that you you put that when we were talking about this series, you do a little behind the curtains here. You do this like brand script for our communications team, and it's just kind of just like where your heart is, what God has given you about this series, and you put that, and you're like, hey, I want us to be, and you said it on Sunday, I want us to be a place where people can ask questions, and I think sometimes we can, church gets portrayed of the places that you just have to have everything together, have to have all the answers, and I love that. Just hey, if you got questions, you don't know what's going, like, come ask the questions here. Like I
think sometimes people feel like if I'm wrestling with my faith, if I'm not sure if I believe all this stuff anymore, the church is sort of the last place that they ought to be. And I'm like, no, we want you to be here. We want to create an environment where you feel like you can wrestle with those questions here with us in community.
Well, and we have a God who welcomes our questions and doubts. The God is not, he can handle our questions. He can handle our doubts. And so I think we ought to encourage people to bring those questions and doubts and for us to do that work together.
Yeah, one of my favorite Jesus stories is where the man comes to Jesus with his boy, Mark chapter 9, and the boy is having these fits, these seizures, and I just imagine that dad who's in this sort of desperate place because he's even fearful that this is going to take the boy's life, and he comes to Jesus and says, Jesus, if you can do anything to help me, please. And Jesus is like, if? And he says, anything's possible for him who believes. Do you believe? And his response, I believe, help my unbelief. And it's just this raw honesty of, yes, I believe. And there is unbelief that's alive and well in me.
Yeah.
All at the same time. And Jesus doesn't scold him. Jesus doesn't shame him. Jesus doesn't balk. Like, how could you possibly? Like, Jesus honors that expression of. And so I think that's something that we can absolutely come to God with this reality. God, I believe. Help me with my unbelief.
There was, when I was, past week or so, I've just been diving into all deconstruction content. Derwin Gray has some good stuff on deconstruction, and just reading different articles. And there's an article I read. It was honestly one of my favorite ones on it, and it was, how do you say this first name, by the way? It's Kirsten. Do you say Kirsten or Kirsten? How would you say it?
I think I'd say Kirsten. I don't know.
I was going to say
don't
Kirsten.
know.
Aha. Gotcha. Yeah. I don't know either. But anyway, let's just say Kirsten Sanders wrote this on Christianity Today, and she was talking about from this personal view of kind of like the furniture in her house and like the furniture in the world and how it's been handed down. Yeah. And it's like, you go throughout every day and you sit on your couch. I have my uses for it. But eventually I had to like really think about, why do I have this couch? Why have I just handed this down? Like, why have I kept it on? And she had this definition that honestly, this is why I'm saying it was my favorite one that I came across. She said, it's the struggle to correct or deepen naive belief. And that's one for me that I held on to the most of.
That's a necessary part of spiritual formation.
Yeah, and I think the next question I want to ask is, what is making people want to deconstruct? Because I think the last time that I've really wrestled with some stuff, I would say in this ballpark, was 2020 George Floyd. And some of the church's response, some of the churches from like my hometown that I grew up in that I'm like valued so much. And it just made me like revisit a lot of things of how the church handled that situation. Big C Church and like some of the churches that have a personal connection to me, that made me really go back to the drawing table of saying, what is this that I've just like left alone in my life that I've like carried on in as far as from a church. So what would you say is the reason why it's become such a big thing over the past 4 or 5 years?
Well, I think part of that is, you brought up 2020, and you're seeing the rise of, you're seeing spiritual abuse in the church, you're seeing complicity in sin, whether that's racism or patriarchy or whatever it is, and then people going through just periods of pain and suffering, injustice, times of crisis. So I mean, you've talked about it in terms of religious hypocrisy, unmet expectations, and your third one was intellectual uncertainty. Yeah, which we can all experience at different times. I think all of those things have contributed to this moment of where we're finding ourselves, where there's deconstruction. I think also social media and just the availability of information that we have now in a way that we haven't had before, at least to this extent, has allowed the increase in information has caused us to question more things, and that's where that piece of, I think, even more intellectual uncertainty is this really true? Because there's all these other places I could go that say something very different. So I think those are some of factors I think of.
Yeah, I mean, those are the four that kind of I walked through in a message last week of intellectual uncertainty, and I think there's just the reality that when you're talking about ultimate things, we are inherently curious and inherently limited. And so I don't care who you're talking to about ultimate things, we are all wrestling intellectually with big, important, weighty kinds of questions. And so those of us who have grown up in a faith tradition or at some point have embraced Christianity still have the intellectual kinds of questions. And I think you're right that in some ways those questions wind up getting amplified through things like social media. So intellectual uncertainty, unmet expectations. And I think there's just this reality that we find ourselves often believing if I do my part in this whole God thing, then God's obligated to meet my expectations. Yeah. And then when life doesn't turn out the way that we thought it was going to, my relationships don't turn out the way that I thought they were going to, or my kids or my grandkids, or what, that we can just find ourselves, this isn't the way I thought it was going to be. This doesn't feel the way I thought it was going to feel. I'm not who I wanted to be. God hasn't come through in the way that I expected. And that can lead to a place of a real struggle. So the third one was religious hypocrisy. So just as, Sissy, you were mentioning, I think we just have these really tragic failures of people who claim the name of Christ who have so worked against what Christ is up to in the world through perpetuating abuse, through being complicit in injustice, issues around race, the sort of political idolatry that the church kind of gets sucked into so much. And more and more people are just finding that so off-putting and really have a hard time distinguishing Christ from Christians. And then just the reality of pain, that I think this is inevitably the place where many will struggle with faith because they're suffering, they're hurting, and that leads to those questions about why God would allow things like this to happen in my life. There's one that I didn't talk about in that sermon, but I think that has to be at least addressed, and that's just the reality of shame. That I think sometimes we all deal with shame. Shame is a natural human response when we've done something wrong, that we feel a sense of shame. But that shame can build up. We talk about the idea shame tells us lies about things that are true, right? So I did something bad. Shame tells us I am bad. Shame lies to us in ways that keep us trapped and keep us stuck. And I think sometimes people can find themselves feeling a deep sense of shame over wrong they've done, patterns in their life, addictions, whatever the case may be, that the God of the Bible, preeminently revealed in Jesus, that we talked about on Sunday, invites us to bring that shame to Him, to have Him embrace us in it and release us from it. But sometimes that shame actually causes us to turn away from God. And we can be drawn to some intellectual questions, and we can be drawn to some of these things that actually wind up allowing us to let go of God so that we don't have to face Him and the reality of our shame. And, I came across an article a while back. You may have seen this one too, Isaac, that kind of went through some of the reasons people are deconstructing, and the fourth reason listed was street cred. And it so bugged me, right? Because
You're
the
a big
whole
street
idea
cred
was,
guy.
well, the whole idea that he was trying to convey in this was, like, some people just, it's the popular thing to do. And there may be something to that idea that, right, you kind of get drawn into this because you're seeing other people do it. And yet most people that go through this process, it's profoundly disorienting. It can be really painful. And I think the church has to be careful that we don't wind up perpetuating a sense of shame that would drive people even further away from God, or further away from the church. That rather we need to be a place that is known for grace, a place that's known for hospitality and welcome, a place that's safe, that allows people who are experiencing that kind of disorientation to find a place that's safe for them.
Yeah, there's even a certain sense in which there's shame in even having questions and doubts.
Sure.
Yeah.
That you're not a good Christian. You shouldn't be having those kinds of questions or doubts. And I think that's what we want to dispel.
Yeah.
That this there are times where there are ideas that have become part of our faith that need to be discarded, that need to be altered, so that we come out with this new paradigm of faith that is more biblical, more robust, more authentic than what we had before.
Yeah, would you say that deconstruction's only for somebody who's at like a low spot in their faith?
I think that winds up oftentimes being kind of when this process begins, as a person is at a place of particular struggle. But, even when I think about my own experience in college, I don't necessarily think that I was at a low place so much as I was just at a place that I was ready to do that work, right? I was open to do the work of really examining things at a deeper kind of level. So, I don't know.
Yeah, I think it can be both. It certainly doesn't have to be a bad spot, because I think of my own journey of, one of the reasons I went through that process is because I was exposed to a lot of different religions that I hadn't been exposed to before. And so I held up Christianity against all these other religions because I didn't know what these religions were about. And so it was more of, and again, I think this is where we're exposed to so much information that oftentimes that can lead to deconstructing. Why do I hold to the Christian faith? Why is this true more than all these other religions? And I had to go through this process of saying, no, what Christianity offers me is far superior and truer than all these other faiths. But I had to do that work to get there. And I think there was before that I hadn't been exposed to those faiths before.
And I do think, that's just sort of like an aha in some ways listening to you talk, is that is something that's also part of the cultural moment.
Yes, yeah.
Because just, when I think about, I remember talking to, my mother one time about, like, she knew one family that wasn't at least sort of ostensibly or culturally Christian.
Right.
She knew one Jewish family, but everybody else that she knew growing up was at least sort of culturally identified as Christian. Well, I grew up in a very different kind of environment where there were a lot of people that didn't necessarily identify as Christian, but I wasn't exposed to a lot of other expressions of faith.
Yep.
And now I think more and more, about the generation of, my young adult kids, and they're growing up very much surrounded by and exposed to people of other faiths. They grew up in the neighborhood with kids that they hung out with, and there can be that sense in which when we find ourselves sort of right up next to, doing life alongside people of other faiths, it causes us to examine some of the deeper aspects of our own faith and, what our faith teaches even about how we understand other faiths and things like that. So that does, I think, contribute to people asking some of these kinds of big questions.
Yeah.
Can you fail at deconstructing?
So I think the worry maybe I have when we think about somebody who's going through this, the sort of pastoral concern is that it stops at the tearing apart, the dismantling. And sort of fails the next step, which is the reconstruction. How do we put this back together? I think people can easily find themselves sort of almost satisfied, going, I've jettisoned all this, I've taken it down, and not actually then do the work, not actually engage the resources, the people who are helping provide answers, if you will, or at least deeper reflection to some of the things that people wrestle with. It's a little bit of I think one of the things pastorally I would say to somebody who's kind of going through is, what are you nurturing more, the doubt or the faith? Right, the faith may feel thin and fragile, and that's okay. Thin and fragile faith is right. I believe, help my unbelief. Right. Are you nurturing that in the sense of like, are you engaging with community, with resources, with writers, with people that are helping? Are you engaging with Jesus, with the Bible, right? Are you things that are nurturing that thin, fragile faith? Or are you just engaging with the people who are asking the questions and who are, does that make sense?
Yes, totally. Yeah. I agree with you. I'm not sure I would say you could fail at deconstruction. I would say my hope would be you would not stop at just asking the questions and then throwing it all out. But that you would wrestle with those questions. I think one of the things that was helpful to me was someone said this to me, and I was like, first it kind of annoyed me, but then I was like, oh, they're right. This is what I should do, is to question your questions and to doubt your doubts. That it's okay to have these questions. It's okay to have your doubts. But it's similar to what you said. If I put everything on those questions and doubts, and that's what I'm focusing on, then that's not the work that's not the real work that I should be doing. But it includes questioning those things. It includes doubting those things. It even includes looking at the other cultural narratives that I hold up as alternatives to the Christian faith and questioning those things. Because if I put my trust in all these other things that the world is offering me, is that actually going to hold up against what the Christian faith offers me, what Jesus offers me? So I think that's what I would say would be my hope for people, to not stop, but to allow the deconstruction to lead to the reconstruction. Yeah,
that's really good. I feel like that's a good stopping point for part one. It's kind of like if you have string cheese, like putting the string cheese back together. Is that a bad analogy? It's not.
Well, I usually just eat it. So.
Okay, so this is the end of part one. We're going to pick this up in part two. And some things in part two. Barry's going to tell a story about convincing a student not to believe in a version of God. We're not just gonna, so we can't clip that. And then we have we want to get in some scripture passages that can help support a healthy way of deconstructing if you are in the midst of that, or if that's on the horizon. So that's kind of a peek into part two. So come back next week as we complete that conversation. But we got to have some fun banter talk. Dun, dun, dun. So I guess it was last week. I was a few minutes late because I was like, hey, I was risking it all on empty in my car. The light was on. It was past the last mark. And I was like, I just have to get gas. I can't risk this anymore. So then it started some stories, and then we were joking, like, I think we could have some banter talk. I feel like I just got to open the floor for Barry. You have a story that you got to...
I do have a story, and, these are stories you don't love telling because they just make you look really bad, really pathetic. But last week was just a crazy week. It was just crazy. My whole week was slammed, and so I don't know how long I'd been going where the gas tank was just getting lower and lower and lower and lower. But I had some running around that I was doing on Saturday and was noticing, oh gosh, it's low, but I got to get to this place, and then I got to get to this other place. And so it just kept going down. And I now actually, for the first time, have the distance to empty on my car. I haven't had a car that's new enough to have that ever. But so it's telling me, and it dings at 25 miles to go and then, 10 miles to go. So at this point now, I'm not thinking about it, and I'm hungry, and it's 3 p.m. I haven't had lunch. And so I go to Chick-fil-A, and it's a crazy, when the line wraps around, it almost feels like it's going to circle a couple of times in Chick-fil-A. Well, I got in line at Chick-fil-A,
no, you didn't.
And it dings.
This is one of my worst nightmares.
And it's at 0.
Oh.
But I had already ordered.
You can't leave.
Well, so
You're in
thankfully,
God's hands now.
the way that this Chick-fil-A drive-through is set up, I could actually pull out, and so I pulled out of the line at Chick-fil-A after I had already ordered and paid.
Okay.
And went and got gas, and then came back and parked and just walked up to the window. She's like, "Oh yeah, here's your food right here." But yeah, it was crazy because I was like, "Oh my gosh, I'm gonna be out of gas in line at Chick-fil-A." Like, there's all these people
All for
here.
a chicken sandwich.
Yeah.
That's
Nuggets.
Nuggets.
It was nuggets. The number
hell,
3.
it gives me
The
anxiety.
number 3.
It gives me anxiety thinking about it. Just like stuck in line, and then you're roasting in your car.
I was sitting there like, can I risk?
What do I
this?
do?
It seemed like the line
Yeah.
was moving a little bit
Could I eat
slower
my
than
sandwich in the heat just in my car? And it's like, at least I got my sandwich.
At least I got Chick-fil-A.
Well, Sissy, have you ran out of gas?
I have not run out of gas.
You're not nearly as pathetic as
Because
Yeah.
I plugged my car into the wall.
No, I don't. I have a 12-year-old car, so it's not being plugged into the wall. But it does have, I love the distance to empty because I do rely on that a lot. So I usually am, I mean, if I'm good, I'll fill up at a quarter, but I'm usually on empty. But I know I've got 35 miles, so.
All right, so yeah, when do you get gas? Like, some people are like, I'm just going to tell you, like, you're insane if you get gas at like half a tank.
Yeah, no, I don't do
You might be a serial killer.
The only time I've done that is if I'm doing like a long car trip and I know I've got to get gas.
Okay,
it's like
sure.
3 hours or whatever, and I don't want to stop in the middle of. It's also very like it's much different here than New Jersey, where in New Jersey we've got these beautiful rest stops. This is not what the state's known for, but maybe it should be.
Are you really going to hype up the rest
I'm going to
stops?
hype up the rest stops on the turnpike.
The bathrooms are great at these rest stops.
You think Buc-ee's is great? So that's maybe the only time. But otherwise, I think if I'm really good, I'll get down to a quarter tank and I'm like, okay, I should fill up now. But typically, I go to empty because I know I've got 35 miles and I feel like I can get a lot of places in 35 miles or 40 miles, whatever it is.
I get way too close way too often.
Yeah, you're going down to zero.
Well,
Are you like
people
team fill up
need
the
to
tank?
know about Pastor Barry. He's not great with details. And so that's one of those details that I don't always pay sufficient attention to.
Gas in his car.
Getting way too close. To the line.
Are you team fill up your tank?
I think it's going to be different now that I actually have like.
No.
Now it
this is-
tells
no.
you?
No, it's
But
not.
we've already proven that
I know.
it's not different.
You already Chick-fil-A
Got all the
run
way
that.
down to zero.
Do you put a
Okay.
certain amount in your gas tank, or are you team like fill up every time?
I fill up.
Really?
Yeah, because
I feel like that's the best way to go.
Yeah, most of the time I'm filling up. Every once in a while, like the Chick-fil-A incident, I just am getting like enough gas to like.
Because he has to get back in line
Because I
for
got
his,
to get back for my
his,
number 3.
for his
Get my
nuggets.
waffle fries.
They're getting cold.
I think the whole conversation around gas. I mean, this could be a whole like hot take thing, but
Wait, what do you do?
Oh, I wait till a fourth of a tank left, and I always put like 20 or 30 in.
Okay.
It's just, and you got to hit that even number, right? Like
Oh,
Yeah.
you're an even number guy.
Yeah.
you go over.
Nope.
It's like, oh, my day's ruined.
Yeah.
Like, well, it's
Really?
like $30 and
Number
28
guy.
cents.
I
I'm like,
could
what is
not
going
care
on?
less. Yeah, I don't.
Thing.
I
Yeah.
I'm off my game today. Like, you know, it's
Yeah.
it's
You
a
gotta
big
get it
like
right.
confidence booster when you hit it right on the dot.
Yeah.
All right, I feel like we gotta end the episode. Barry, you had some supernatural.
Well,
It's
okay,
either
I'll
the
give
Lord or an alien.
Yeah, we don't know quite for sure.
Just-
I'll try to give the quick version of it. This was early on. I can't remember if Kim and I were dating or early on in our marriage, but we're driving one night and it's dark out. We're on Interstate 30 near Fort Worth, and it was under construction at the time, which I think has been perpetually true since then for the last 26 years or whatever. But we're driving and under construction, and so on either side of the lane are the concrete barriers. And we're coming up this hill, and the car dies, like as we've crested the hill. So the car is dead in the lane, and there's no getting out
Right.
of the. We got concrete on either side of us, and I'm just terrified that there's going to come a car that's just speeding up over that hill and just slams right in the back of us. And all of a sudden, out of nowhere, light from heaven. I mean, the car was bathed in light. So apparently there was either a helicopter up there
Yeah.
that saw this whole thing happening and realized, like, I need to shine my light down on it. Or it was an angelic light. I'm not quite sure. But we're grateful that whatever it was there, because the the light shining down on us. So the car came up behind us and was able to see us, and realized we were there because of this light, and so slowed down, and they just pulled up behind us and pushed the car forward. We had the car towed, couldn't figure out what was going on. My brother-in-law was a mechanic, and so we had the car towed to his shop, and he, gets under the hood and is trying to, figure it out, and then realizes it was out of gas. So I swear I don't think there was any indication on the dashboard.
It's okay. He has a new car now, so it'll never happen.
This is a pattern.
The needle was messed up or something. I don't think there was a light on, but it died out of gas, and the angelic helicopter saved
Well,
us.
that's it for this week's episode of X-Files and Barry's encounter with aliens or the Lord.
and running out of gas.
Or a helicopter running out of gas. All right, we'll be back next week for part 2 on deconstruction.